So today's topic, for someone who's just came on, who's asking what's this about, is about how do people become abusers. So if you've experienced abuse in your life, oftentimes we wonder, like, well, how could my parents have done that? Or how could this person, this family member, this teacher, this person that I trusted, right? How could they have done that to me? All right. So what I'm doing is I'm talking about where does this come from? Where do why do people do this type of stuff? So this is something that Alice Miller talks about. This is something that a lot of psychologists talk about. So where we have somebody who is disconnected from their human emotion, from their human sympathy or empathy. So if somebody was abused as a child, maybe they were really harshly spanked as a child, or beaten, right? Or maybe sexually abused when they were very small. What can happen psychologically is that person will disconnect from their emotions. They disconnect from their emotions about that thing because they're trying to protect themselves as a tiny little child, right? And so, in order to protect themselves, in order to survive, in order to continue to live with and have to love this parent or person who is abusing them, but they're dependent on that person for their full survival, right? I mean, if that person doesn't feed them and take care of them and walk them, they're going to die. So they have to maintain a kind of emotional connection to this authority figure in order to get what they need to survive. So what they can do sometimes, a small child, this is like from psychology, is they cut off their link to their own emotions. So what happens is then when they interact with somebody else, right, with their own children, they have cut off their link to their own emotions. So they're like, well, my parent beat me, so, and I turned out fine, right? That's that kind of attitude. So now I'm going to beat my child and, it's out of love, you see? So that kind of thing comes from when you have disconnected from your own emotions and you don't just like look at that tiny little baby and just think, oh my God, like how shocking and horrible would it be to all of a sudden like be hit by someone who's supposed to love you and protect you? You see, that would just like, I mean, it just explodes your whole understanding of the world when that happens to you as a tiny baby, as a tiny child. So that is another reason why people can become abusers. So when I thought about it, I was like how could my father have just spanked his kids so harshly? I mean, like using a paddle, using, coat hangers, using all kinds of things. Like, didn't he have some kind of emotional like thing looking at that poor little kid and thinking, oh my God, like, screaming and crying and weeping like that? Terrible, right? So my question, like, how could he have done that? If he was beaten as a small child, then he would disconnect his own empathy to himself, right? Now that doesn't happen to everybody. Thank God. Otherwise, everybody who was raised horribly would abuse their children. Thank God, not everybody does disconnect. Some people really still maintain that connection and they can recognize, wow, this thing that happened to me wasn't right. This was wrong. I'm never going to do that to my children. Okay. So that is very powerful, but that is something that happens. And if that happened to you, I'm really sorry. And if your parents did that to you, hopefully this might give you some kind of an understanding of where that kind of abuse can happen, even from someone that in other ways doesn't necessarily seem like they're really a bad person. You see?
In your book, you mentioned a time where your dad was damn near breaking down the door, and you were in the
He did break down the
bathroom.
door. Yeah.
Yeah, and you just kind of felt numb. What kind of experiences did you go? If you want to get into it, what kind of experiences did you go through growing up with your parents, or what trauma do you think you went through, and what was your relationship like with them?
So one of the things was that I just had as an infant, like very young, like 3 weeks old or something. I had a really bad case of colic, which is just, do you know what colic is?
No.
I wouldn't know either. I still kind of don't know. I think it's like it's a yeast infection, but you get it in your mouth, and like
Oh, I
because you have to
remember.
eat through.
I
Yeah.
remember you talking about this in your book. Yeah.
Yes, yes. It was so terrible that my parents said that I would cry like 23 and a half hours a day and just constant crying. It would be so bad that my mom had a nervous breakdown over it. they would just put me in a room by myself to cry because like what could you do, like hold me for the 23 and a half hours, like you have to sleep, you have to eat. I had older brothers, one of them was like still in diapers, and I guess we were in cloth diapers, and like my dad wouldn't buy my mom a dryer, so she had to like wash all these cloth diapers and like hang the cloth diapers up on the clothesline. And my brother had problems too. He would like frequently have diarrhea because he has like gastrointestinal issues. It's funny how like when your parents get older, maybe you haven't experienced this yet, you're not quite as old as I am. But like your parents start kind of like going through these like trips down memory lane where they're like, yeah, I did have a nervous breakdown about that. Or like, I really should have known about your brother. Like we should have taken him to the hospital or to the doctor because that wasn't right. Like there was something wrong with him, and he still has problems to this day. And so my mom feels like a lot of guilt, especially with me and my brother, about like the way that she was when we were little, which was very probably absent because she was having this nervous breakdown. So my guess is that just wasn't good for my brain development, my social brain development, to just be isolated in a room crying, like basically all day. And then there were other things too, like, so my dad, I've mentioned before, his emotions kind of so big, he like kind of, takes up all the room. So I would say that he has narcissistic personality disorder. I don't judge him either, even after all the bad things that he did to me, because he had like way more, I think they're called ACEs, the childhood traumas that you experience, and there's like a certain number that you can have of ACEs. He has like basically every ACE that there could be, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, starvation, just like, being separated from your mother like at an early age, like just all these crazy things that would like, crazy deaths in the family, all these kind of traumatic experiences that you could have. And so it's like it's kind of a wonder to me that he's as functional in society as he is, like good for him for being able to.
What do you expect when someone goes through all these different, like there's PTSD and there's CPTSD, which is like complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's like, that's just multiple instances happening to you over time that affect the way your brain is developing and as you're growing. So, I mean, in my head, I'm just like, it's kind of like the cards you were dealt, and like, what did you expect was going to happen? Unless that child was taken out of that situation somehow and the cycle was broken, what do you expect is going to happen?
Yeah. And he wasn't taken out of that situation. And like, I don't know what's up with his parents. It's a little easier for me to judge them for some reason because I don't know their background, like their backstory. Maybe they too had all these traumatic events. They never said anything about it, but they would have like 8 people like sleeping in like a one bedroom. Can you imagine? It's just like bunk bed, bunk bed, bunk bed, and then 2 people sleeping in the middle. It's like, okay, like, do you guys think that that maybe these children are not getting sufficient resources for whatever is happening? And he still has like all these, obvious psychological scars that he carries with him. Like he's like a hoarder, and he's like food aggressive, and just like all these things that he struggles with, and he has a hard time with his temper, and he's also had multiple concussions, like really bad concussions. And I know that he's not trying to, like, I know he doesn't want his grandchildren to be afraid of him. He really is trying, but he just never got like the help that he needed. Unfortunately, he would, as kind of a defense mechanism himself for some of this childhood trauma, he needed things to be like, he needed to feel like he was in control of things all the time. So, there were obviously like abusive things, physical abuse or other things that would happen. But I think almost more insidious and maybe contributing more to the development of the personality disorder that I have were kind of like the little things that he would do. So I remember this like a few years ago. It's just like a little story, but I shared a bedroom with my 2 sisters, and I'm the oldest of that group. And so they were still playing with like Barbies and stuff. And by the time I got to be like 10 or 11, I was like, I'm done with Barbies, and I don't like your toys everywhere. Like this place is a mess. Like keep your toys away from my stuff. And so what I did is I put like some masking tape like around my bed and kind of just made like a little area and said, this is my area, keep your toys out of my area. And then when he came in and saw it, he was so angry. He's like foaming at the mouth, like, this is not your room. These are not your toys. Everything's mine. And he starts ripping up the tape and like getting so angry about it. But it's just like anytime that you try to do that, either physically or kind of emotionally, psychologically, just kind of like carve out some space for
A
yourself and
boundary.
just be, yes, a boundary, yes, a personal boundary, and say, this is me and mine, and you can't come over it. That was always the thing that reliably triggered him. In fact, if you remember, when he tore down the door is when I took this like phrase from my mom. She would say, I'm rolling up my window on you, basically like a boundary, like I'm not going to listen to you right now. And to him, with his personality disorder, the way that he would experience that is just like his existence was being totally disregarded. You know, that I was saying, you're not a person. I'm disregarding you, 10 out of 10 right now. Like, you're nothing to me. That's how it would feel to him, So like a normal person asserting boundaries just feels like a total existential threat to him. And so he just like flies off the handle, which again, it's not really his fault, but you can see how it contributed maybe to like me just being like, well, I'm just not going to assert myself then. Like, I'm going to stop putting the tape up. I'm going to stop having personal boundaries. In fact, I'm going to stop having a personality at all. Kind of. I'm just going to, detach from that part of me. And because that's safer, because when I'm connected to my identity and he attacks it like that, it hurts so badly. It's such a terrible emotional, psychological hurt that it's, in order for me to survive, I just, as a defensive mechanism, just need to disconnect from like any real sense of my identity.
Okay.
I should say though, it's important. I like work with this one psychologist with her nonprofit, psychopathyis.org. And she's always says, but not everybody develops a personality disorder or psychopathy this way. So I should say that, like, not everybody experiences trauma, but I usually think there's something, it's not maybe necessarily parents. There's something that kind of like seems to push them down, like genes don't get triggered for nothing. Sometimes they do, I guess, but usually there's some sort of environmental trigger that kind of helps those genetics express themselves. But those genetics express themselves to protect me. Like I could probably not have lived without some sort of defense mechanism through all of that, And so it's hard not to kind of be grateful for it too, because it's what allowed me to like get to where I am now, to, grow as old as I am without being just crazy.